It's very appropriate that Luke picked songs all about God's faithfulness this morning. We're going to be talking about marriage. And marriage is used in several different places in the Bible as an analogy for God's faithfulness to us, that just as in a marriage we are faithful to our spouse, that we will nourish and cherish our spouse, so God nourishes and cherishes His bride, which is the church. The book of Hosea in the Old Testament very similarly draws from the marriage between a husband and a wife, literally, and the relationship that God has with His people in the Old Testament, and how personally He takes that relationship, both for the good as well as for the pain that is inflicted when one is unfaithful in that relationship. So let's talk about marriage this morning, but one element of marriage that I want to focus on is the flexibility that we're supposed to have in our marriages. There are things that we're supposed to be flexible in, but there are some things, as we'll point out later on in the lesson, that we're not supposed to be flexible about. If you're visiting here with us this morning, and this is your very first time visiting, we're very, very glad that you're here. We ask that you fill out a visitor's card for us so that we can get in touch with you this week and find out if there's anything of a spiritual nature that we can do for you. If you have questions for us, just let us know. And we would love to open up our Bibles and study together, especially if you'd like to learn about Jesus Christ and what it really means to be the spiritual bride of Christ. Well, that certainly is a complicated but wonderful, beautiful thing to explore. And if you'd like to learn more about that, then please let us know. I'm very glad that you're here today. Very, very glad that we've come together to worship God. What a beautiful and wonderful day that it is. There's a book called The Most Important Year in a Woman's and a Man's Life. And the authors make it very, very clear in this book that oftentimes it's the first few years of a marriage that really help to set that marriage up for success or possibly for failure. They are formative years. One quote from page 19 says that particularly for a husband, there is a receptivity to change during this time, perhaps as at no other time in his life. We call this the wet cement year. And that's where the title of wet cement comes from, which is the flexibility that we're supposed to have in our marriages, especially in those first few years. You know, we get married and we've got all this energy and enthusiasm and excitement, and everything is new and everything is beautiful. And we do have a number of newlyweds in our congregation, both really recent newlyweds as well as people who've just been married for a couple of years now. And so I hope that this really speaks to us in our church and in our marriages, that there's a time in your marriage where it's like everything is brand new. And you're trying to kind of figure out, like, okay, as a couple, are we, what brand of toothpaste do we use all the time? What do we do as far as dinner goes? Are we late dinner people, early dinner type people? Are we like meal planners? And we've got like 2 weeks of meals already planned out and they're in the fridge and the freezer? Or are we one of those couples that's like every afternoon at 4 o'clock on the way home from work, we're like, oh, I got stuff by Kroger. What are we going to get for dinner tonight? That's us, by the way. But it's those first couple years, the wet cement years, where you're kind of molding and shaping a lot of things about your marriage that once it sets and once that hardens, it becomes a lot harder to change those kinds of habits later on. Now, you might be thinking, oh, I'm not a newlywed. Maybe you've been married for 40, 50, 60, 70 years. How many years now, Neil? How many years? But no matter how many years you've been married, let me tell you that this is an important thing to get right and why it's important. So even before you're married, maybe you're not married in here, you're young and you're single. Even before you get married, you're still going to be shaped and influenced in a lot of ways by your people that you're around and what you're exposed to. Premarital sex, for example, the way that you live now and the kind of sinful life that you may have now, don't think for a moment that that kind of stays in a vacuum and that it's never going to impact you for the rest of your life. But the memories and experiences that you have as a single person and the sins that you commit now as a single person, those are going to impact you for the rest of your life. You're going to carry that with you for the rest of your life. But it's not even necessarily sinful things, but things like bad habits as well. When you're single, you can sort of get away with a lot of bad habits. You can get away with the way that you manage your affairs in your household, the way that, grooming habits, how you spend your money. But what's interesting is like bad habits as a single person quickly become deal breakers when you get into a long-term relationship with somebody. Your relationship with your parents or your siblings also sets you up for failure or success when you get married. Your parental example also goes a long way in forming preconceptions about what marriage is. If you're raising kids and you've got preteen kids, like I have, what my kids see of my marriage is going to set up a lot of expectations for their own marriage. What my kids see of me as a husband to Rebecca makes a big difference in forming like what kind of a husband Sterling is striving to be and what kind of a husband my girls are going to be looking for and attracted to. And again, I can set them up for failure or success. Newlyweds in our congregation, they need to see that today's minor irritant leads to tomorrow's deadly infection. And I always caution when I do premarital counseling with couples, you really need to look at what annoys you about this person now. And I do think when we're kind of gaga and head over heels for someone, we may look at someone's faults and go, well, I'm okay with that. I can live with that. After 20 years? Are you sure? Now, I'm certainly not an advocate for divorcing for whatever reason. We'll get to Matthew 19 a little bit later in the lesson, so hold off on that. But I think when you are a young couple and you're looking at these kinds of habits that we have, stuff that you can sort of ignore now, okay, I'll get used to it. I'll probably be able to get used to it. You might not. And what just is kind of an irritant now, what is just a pebble in your shoe now may become quite debilitating later on if it's left unresolved. And the same is true of long-time married couples as well. People who have been married for a long time need to see the value of ongoing flexibility. And we'll talk about that in our next section. But I think as couples get older, they kind of get to this recalcitrant point in life where they go, well, I haven't changed in all these years. I'm not going to start changing now. Yeah, there's a lot of things in marriage where flexibility, even 20, 30, 40 years down the road, where flexibility can be very, very good for you. Remember from the Bible, some of the great married couples in the Bible only began their greatest adventures when they were very advanced in years and had been married for a long time. We don't know hardly anything about Abraham and Sarah. Before you get to Genesis 12, there's almost nothing that you know of their life. It's almost like the end of Genesis 11 comes plop, here's Abraham and Sarah, and then Genesis 12 is now they're going to go on the adventure of a lifetime. These are 80-year-old people who everything else they did up to this point is immaterial compared to the adventure that they're about to go on now. Abraham and Sarah were 80-year-old people, and the time of their life between 80 and 100 was the most exciting, life-altering period of their lives together. And they were flexible enough that when God said, uproot, take all your stuff, cross the desert, go to a land full of people that you don't know, who don't speak your language, and don't have any customs, and you have no connections and no family there, you know what Abraham and Sarah did? As really, really elderly people, they did it. And their whole life was changed for the better. And so don't tell me that you reach one, well, I'm just too old to change now. Was Abraham too old to change now? I don't think so. Some of the most exciting things that we can do as married couples happen only after we have a ton of life experiences already under our belts. But while we're on the subject of the cement getting hard and set and, I'm set in my ways. Let's acknowledge it is our natural tendency to become set in our ways like cement. You leave cement long enough, you pour it, you shape it, you form it, and you leave it alone, and what's going to happen to it eventually? Well, that cement is going to set, and it's going to become hard, and then it doesn't want to change. It doesn't want to be shaped. It doesn't want to mold into anything else but what it already is. And the problem is that after a while, when that hard, stubborn cement comes up against other natural forces, weather changes, a tree root growing underneath it, what happens to that inflexible cement when it meets other forces? Well, it cracks. It cracks. But remember that what is natural is not necessarily right. So just because it's our natural tendency to stiffen and harden and kind of get stubborn, that doesn't make it okay. There's several passages up on the screen, like 1 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 14, that talks about the natural man. James chapter 3 verses 14, 15 also talks about this wisdom is not that which comes down from above, but is earthly, natural, and demonic. And you know what that wisdom is in James chapter 3? It's selfish ambition. It's selfishness. And where that selfishness exists, disorder and every other evil thing exists along with it. So yeah, it might be well, hey, listen, it's just natural for us to get more stubborn as we get older. It's just natural for us. I'm just set in my ways now. Like, that doesn't make it right. Maybe that's natural, but that doesn't make it right. Christians, on the other hand, are not described as stubborn people set in our ways. Actually, Christians are described in some really interesting language. Like in 1 Peter chapter 2, we're called living stones. And what's interesting about that is you don't normally think of a stone as living. You normally think of the stone as being stubborn and set in his ways. That stone's been there for all these thousands of years, unchanged and unaffected, and yet God says that we become living stones. It's almost like all the best things about being a stone, its permanence, its steadfastness, all the best things about being a stone, but all the best things about being alive as well, are combined in being a Christian. In Ezekiel chapter 36, in foreshadowing the new covenant in Christ, in Ezekiel 36, God says, I'm going to take your hard, dead, stone heart, and I'm going to replace it with a living heart. And that can happen to anybody at any age. And I guess my point is this. If at any age in your life, you can be changed as to go from being dead in your sins to alive in Christ at any age, at any point in your life. Don't tell me that at any point in your marriage you can't go from stubborn and miserable to flexible, learning, and growing at any point in your marriage. We are capable of change, though it does require us to go against what feels natural. We do make a lot of excuses for ourselves, don't we? We say, well, our marriage has just always been this way, and it might not work well, but it works. I think that's kind of a lousy and lazy thing to say about a marriage. Like, well, that's we've sort of settled into a routine that works for us. I mean, so you don't even want to put the effort into maybe making it work better. It doesn't work well, but it works. Yeah, it could work well, though. You realize, with a little compromise, a little more communication, a little less stubbornness, you realize your marriage could be a lot better. We don't need help in our marriage. I think we've just got everything right. Well, if that's true, and I doubt that it is, but if it's true, if you believe that everything is great in your marriage and you're doing marriage perfectly, then please teach the rest of us how to do it better. I mean, if you've got all that wisdom, well, share it then. And I know that's kind of comes across as sarcastic, but I'm serious. If you think your marriage is just perfect and there's nothing that needs to be improved, then please share that with the rest of us so that we can make our marriages better. We're just too old to change now. I don't know. I think that's just the lazy excuse that people make when they're distant in their marriage. Husbands who don't like to talk, don't like to listen, don't like to communicate. Wives who nag too much. Couples who argue over every little thing. Oh, we're just too old to change now. Or this is just the way that I am. Take it or leave it. Take it or leave it. You know, I think it's, how would we feel if that's what the gospel was? Like, how would we feel if the gospel was presented like that? It was just like so stark. The gospel was unmerciful, unloving, no grace. The gospel was brusque, hard, rude. How would we feel if that's how Jesus was as a husband? Jesus read Ephesians 5, like, nourishes and cherishes her, that old hag? And yet that's not the language that Jesus uses. Nourishes and cherishes? Like your own flesh? Remember how Hosea was. And we'll go back to Hosea, maybe one other time in this lesson if we've got time, but in Hosea, remember, Hosea was a prophet, and God came in his life and asked for a really, really weird thing. Hosea, I want you to go on down to the red light district, and there's a woman there, you're going to marry her. Yes, Hosea was told to go marry a prostitute. Now, that's not a knock on Hosea. Hosea dutifully went and did what he was told and married a woman named Gomer. She was a prostitute. And he really did love her, by the way. He really, really did. Chapter 3. Go again and love a woman who is loved by her husband. Hosea actually really deeply loves Gomer. But Gomer has a hard time leaving her fancy life behind. Chapter 2, of Hosea talks all about how she looked back at her old life, all the gifts that they used to give her, the nice things, the nice clothes, the food, the wine. Oh, they used to treat me so good back in that life. And I imagine that going from being a successful, high-level, luxurious prostitute, and then going and marrying a prophet of God, I imagine there was a big lifestyle change that had to happen. And all those nice things that the men used to give her, all the dainty gifts and the nice food and the clothes and and the perfumes and everything, like that probably doesn't describe the accoutrements of the wife of a prophet of God. And so she leaves her husband and goes back to her wife of harlotry, and God says, now you know how I feel. Now you know how I feel. This is just what I am, we say. Take it or leave it. Well, where's the grace? Where's the compromise? We can't be like that, my friends. Now, with all that being said, at the risk of somewhat undermining the cement analogy that we've been playing with this morning, there is an element of permanency to marriage that shouldn't be overlooked. Yes, we want to be flexible. We don't want to become stubborn and recalcitrant. But let's remember, there are a lot of things in marriage that should never flex. Marriage is not a dalliance. Marriage is not a dalliance. Fornication and adultery are sins. We ought to say that more often, shouldn't we? Because we live in a very sex-saturated culture and watch all these TV shows, every sitcom, every comedy, it's so saturated. Let's be very clear, and let's cry it from the rooftops if we have to. Fornication and adultery are sins. Plain and simple, and marriage stands alone as the only holy union of man and woman. Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 4. Let the marriage bed be undefiled, he says. Let marriage be held in honor. For fornicators and adulterers, God will judge. Sex for its own sake is a manifestation of selfishness, indulgence, and depravity. Ezekiel chapter 23, God uses this analogy in Ezekiel 23 of these two women, two sisters. They represented Judah and Israel, by the way. And they're these like brazen women who it's all about sex, 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 sex in their life. That is the only thing they talk about, the only thing they think about, the only thing that they do. And they're portrayed in this incredibly disgusting and depraved way in Ezekiel chapter 23. Marriage, on the other hand, is permanent insofar as two people's physical lives coincide. And Jesus could not have been any clearer about it. Echoing this permanence from the book of Genesis, Jesus talks about marriage in Matthew chapter 19. He's asked by some people, "Hey, Jesus, we were wondering, can a man just divorce his wife for any reason at all?" And Jesus says in response in verse 4, "Have you not even read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? And for this reason, and said, for this cause a man shall leave his father and mother and shall cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Consequently, they are no longer two but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate." And of course, they have a follow-up question to that, like, "Oh, what about divorce? What if you got all your paperwork in order? How about that? As long as you fill out your paperwork, then, is that okay?" And I think Jesus scoffs at the notion of the paperwork and the divorce and what Moses said. He said, "Because of your hardness of heart, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives." Like, well, that sure says a lot about you, doesn't it? So technically you can divorce, right? Because of your hardness of heart. You really want to take up that argument? You really want to be on that side because of your hardness of heart? But from the beginning, it has not been this way. And Jesus unequivocally, crystal clear, and absolutely says in verse 9, "I say to you," I don't care what Moses said. I don't care what the law says. I say unto you that whoever divorces his wife except for immorality and marries another woman commits adultery. And we just read Hebrews 13, verse 4, fornicators and adulterers, God will judge. The real pleasure of marriage does not come in our selfish pursuit. What I want, what I'm going to get out of this, what I need from this marriage. Actually, pleasure in marriage is a byproduct of selflessness, not selfishness. It's a byproduct of the effort that we put into marriage. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, beginning in verse 1, the Apostle Paul talks about how a husband and a wife ought not to separate from each other in their sexual union, except by agreement, and only then as a way to rededicate their lives to God or because of prayer. But he says that, let's be clear about this. One of the reasons why we come together in marriage is because it is a holy and moral outlet for those physical desires that we have. So he declares in 1 Corinthians 7 that a wife's body is not her own. Her body belongs to her husband. And a husband's body is not his own. And his body belongs to his wife. And it's in the selflessness of marriage that we actually find pleasure. The world typically has that backwards. God should always be the glue. That's another inflexible element of marriage, that God is always the glue that holds a relationship together. God is the co-signer. He is the witness of the covenant between us. Malachi chapter 2 and verse 14, "I am a witness between you and the wife of your youth." Matthew chapter 19 and verse 6. And so even though there are things in marriage that are flexible and impermanent and should change and we should compromise, there are other things that are permanent. And it is the permanent and the impermanent when working together in harmony that allow a marriage to exist in peace and in joy and in happiness. And in a way, it's the permanent parts of marriage that actually make the impermanent parts possible. And here's what I mean by this. Because I know that my vows are rock solid concrete, then it means that I can talk to Rebecca honestly and plainly, and I know that our marriage is not in jeopardy. Why? Because the vow is concrete. And so I know that because we are not going to get divorced and she's not going to leave me for someone else because our vows are inflexible and rock solid, then we can move through conflict together. We can argue about things together. And we know that our relationship is safe. Because I know that I'm safe in my marriage, and I know that I am accepted by my spouse physically and with all of my faults, it also means that I can be physically and emotionally vulnerable to my spouse. And so it's the permanent things in marriage that actually make the impermanent things possible. So 4 applications, and we'll bring the lesson to a close. What does this look like in practice? What does it look like to be the wet cement in a marriage? Point number 1 is each season you go through is reality. Here's what I mean by that. Don't take yesterday's expectations and place them upon today. Don't take tomorrow's hopes and dreams and goals and thrust them upon today. Today is today, and today is your only reality. It is your only reality. Accept what today is for what it is. And you're going to go through seasons in a marriage where you're going to have to adjust your expectations and adjust what it means to be satisfied in something. And certainly, we don't want to get into a ton of detail. These are private matters between a husband and a wife, but we do need to say something here that our expectations of a sexual nature are probably going to have to change and be adjusted as we go through different seasons of a marriage. And you can't take the expectation of yesterday and place it upon today, because today has a reality of its own that has to be confronted honestly. Whether it's illness that exists, physical impairment of some kind, changes in your financial situation, changes in your emotional state, changes in your work relationships, all of those things can have a huge impact on various aspects of our marriage. And so you can't take yesterday's expectations and place them upon today. Today is reality. Live in today and be okay with what today is. Jesus himself also put it really well in the Sermon on the Mount that you can't be anxious about tomorrow, because today has enough things of its own. You got to worry about stuff today first and let tomorrow be tomorrow. But today, you got to live in today. Handle today and expect only what today can offer. There's a number of examples from the Bible that you can show. There are couples in the Bible that changed expectations. Joseph and Mary. You think when Joseph was betrothed to Mary that he had any idea what was in store for him? Well, I just thought she was a pretty girl that my parents approved of. Didn't know she'd be the mom of the Messiah. And yet, we admire Joseph a great deal, and Mary as well, because of their willingness to really change expectations and to align their will with God's will. There are other people in the Bible who really struggled with that. Rachel, for example. Rachel thought that she was number 1. She thought Jacob was her number 1. And this whole thing, getting married to Leah, and now I guess we're polygamists now. Really changed the whole term sister wives literally there, aren't we? Rachel goes from, in one chapter, Rachel goes from being madly head over heels in love with Jacob to the next chapter saying, give me children or just let me die. And Jacob hated her for it. Gomer, she struggled to go from being kind of a living in the lap of luxury, a harlot with kind of a nice glamorous life and a lot of gifts, a lot of nice things, to being a prophet's wife. And she had a really hard time with that adjustment. Job's wife also. Job's wife was used to a certain lifestyle, accustomed to the way that life was. And when she saw her pathetic, scab-ridden, miserable excuse of a nobody husband sitting there in the dirt, you know what Job's wife told him? Why don't you just curse God and die? Those were her words. She had a hard time adjusting expectations. Point number 2, uncompromising people, the unworkable cement. Those kinds of people are doomed to failure. Lot is a great example. Lot is a great example. Lot practically had to be dragged out of Sodom. He dragged his feet the whole way, hemming and hawing, and, I'm not so sure about this. Do you want to die or not? And those angels practically had to drag him out of Sodom. And his wife looked back because she wasn't sure what the future had in store for them. And she got turned into a pillar of salt because she was uncompromising. And then Lot goes and lives in a cave with his 2 daughters and won't let them out of the house anymore, out of the cave anymore. You know what his daughters do? They get him drunk. And he impregnates them. Yes, he impregnated his own daughters. You know why? Because uncompromising people are doomed to failure. If you can't compromise in your marriage, if you can't adjust in your marriage, if you can't meet people halfway, talk to people, listen to people, open yourself up to people, if you can't be wet cement in your marriage, you are doomed to fail, and it'll ruin you. A third point, you have to keep adding water, because just like with cement, if you don't keep the cement moist, what happens to it? Well, it dries out, it sets and it hardens. And that's true. I think in our marriages, we have to give. We have to keep giving in our marriages. If you want your spouse to be flexible, you have to give what they need to be flexible. And hopefully that gets returned to you as well. But it starts with you. It starts with me. I can't sit around and wait for Rebecca to be a great wife, though she is a great wife, but it doesn't start with her. I don't sit here with my arms crossed going, listen, when she figures out how to be a good wife, I'll go ahead and put more effort into being a good husband. It has to start with me. And I have to add water. And I have to add the ingredients that are necessary to make this a great marriage with her. It has to start with me. And once, twice, over and over and over again, I have to keep doing it. When these words in Ephesians 5 or Colossians 3, when it says nourish your spouse, cherish your spouse, love your spouse, husbands, love your wives and be embittered against them. You know what's involved in nourishing, cherishing, and loving? It's not a one-time thing. You don't feed a baby a bottle one time and go, we did it. We gave it a bottle. We're done. Nourishing and cherishing requires day after day, sometimes hour after hour after hour of nourishing and cherishing. And so in a marriage, you have to keep on adding what needs to be added. And finally, use language in your marriage that softens, not stiffens. You know, when you want to be critical, there's a way to do it. And I think there's a place in marriage for criticism. There's a place in marriage for being honest about things that are and are not working. And I think there's certainly a healthy way that you can go about that. But there's also a really unhealthy way that you can go about it. A couple of Proverbs here. And I know that we're out of time here, so I'll go ahead and keep this short. But in the book of Proverbs, just follow along with me here. There's a series of Proverbs that I think illustrates an evolution in the way that we can speak to each other productively. Really, actually, the way I have them laid out is sort of a de-evolution. In Proverbs chapter 15 and verse 1, it says, a gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. Verse 4, a soothing tongue is a tree of life, but perversion in it crushes the spirit. Verse 28, the heart of the righteous ponders how to answer, but the mouth of the wicked pours out evil things. And it says in chapter 21 of the book of Proverbs, chapter 21 and verse 9, it's better to live in the corner of your roof than in a house shared with a contentious woman. And he goes on and says in verse 19, it's better to live in a desert land than with a contentious and vexing woman. Now, he's not picking on women in particular there, but I think what he's saying that in any marriage, there's language that we can use, the gentle answer, the soft language. There's language that we can use that softens and helps people to be flexible, helps people to be compromising. And there's language that we use that just stiffens it up, ends the conversation. Now, I'm not an expert on women. I know you, whatever assumptions you might have, I'm not an expert on women. So I say this from a man's perspective. And as a man, I can tell you what works and what doesn't work. There's language that you can use around men and with a husband where it's phrasing things in the language of pleasure rather than complaint, in the language of success rather than failure. It's saying things like, let me just give you some examples. Being obvious, saying, I like that. A husband needs to know that you like that. Not, I don't like this, but when you phrase it as, I like that, that really works with a husband. Saying, well, I don't like it when you do this. Husbands typically will shut down at that point because it's failure. And husbands hate to fail. Husbands hate to feel like they've not been the breadwinner, like they've not been the warrior, like they've not been the protector. And when you tell a husband that he's failed, it tears at the very core of, I think, what makes a man a man. I don't like that. Equals to a husband, I'm a failure and I'm worthless. So I'm going to go ahead and be quiet in the garage now and not talk to her anymore. Versus, I like it when you do this. You're still offering the same criticism, aren't you? You're still trying to guide toward different behavior, toward a different end, and yet it's the language of pleasure and success and victory and achievement says, I really like it when you do this. Similarly, being very clear about people, instead of saying, you know, I noticed you the other day, you failed over at this thing. You're not doing this thing. You forgot to do this again. The times that they do succeed, say, hey, I noticed you did that the other day. I want to tell you how much I appreciate that. I noticed when you did that. You know what a husband will do? The moment you say, hey, I noticed that you did that, you know what that husband's going to do? That will be etched in his brain like laser writing on a piece of metal. And he's going to, for the rest of his life, go, I need to make sure I do that. Every day, I'm going to do that. And they'll remember that forever. This is what I need. To be really obvious about that. Men we don't handle puzzles very well. We don't handle mysterious language. We don't read the tea leaves. We're just not good at reading the tea leaves. And dropping the hints without just obviously saying, hey, this is what I need from you right now. Men appreciate that. Men like we like an instruction manual, and we like to know this is like when you as a man, when you Google something, I want point. Just give me the main points. That's all. We like highlight reels. We like to watch highlight reels. And so when you phrase things as, this is what I need, from that same book, The Most Important Year in a Woman's and a Man's Life, the author said, a woman who waits around for her husband to figure out what it is that she needs from him will likely be waiting a very long time. And so I just try to keep that in mind. And that's true of all of us, not just husbands, wives, all of us. Remember in Galatians chapter 5 and verse 15, the way that the Apostle Paul talks about the biting and devouring there, that when you bite and devour one another, be careful lest you consume one another. Destructive, biting, critical language is self-destructive to ourselves. It's also destructive to other people, and that's always going to tear down a marriage. And so we need to avoid that kind of language as well. Now, maybe you're not a Christian here today. I certainly hope that something that we've said has spurred you on to think a little bit deeper about your spiritual condition. You're living in sin. If you are not in Jesus Christ, then you are living in sin. And you're in a hopeless and helpless situation unless you take the hand that is reaching out to you, which is the hand of Jesus himself, speaking through the gospel, that I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. If you'd like to study a little bit more, we can do that with you. But if you know what you need to do and you've studied already, you know what the New Testament has to say about salvation, it's time to act upon that now. Don't delay any longer. Whatever spiritual need you have, let it be known by coming forward as we stand and sing.